Good morning. My name is Jeff Schock. I'm excited to be able to share today's teaching with you. If you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to Romans chapter 12. We've been looking at Romans for, seems like a while now. We're coming to chapter 12, and Paul he's becoming exceedingly practical. He's talked about these big 30,000-foot heaven's eye theological principles like salvation by grace, and now he is getting very, very practical, which is good. Romans 12, verses 1 through 8. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. This is the word of the Lord. This passage is all about the Christian life. And we're going to look at it under three headings: the nature of the Christian life, the facets of the Christian life, and the keys to the Christian life. So the nature, the facet, and the keys. First, the nature. Verse 1, first word, it's right there, therefore. And we know when they say therefore, you got to ask, what's it there for, right? So you see it therefore, what is Paul referencing? And he's referencing everything he has said in the preceding 11 chapters. In fact, right where it says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, is a way for him to kind of repeat that sentiment, therefore. So you've got to consider, this is the last part of an equation, and the preceding part was everything else he has said up until now. And if you've been here over the course of this series, you know that this is Paul's most holistic, most robust treatment of the gospel of grace. This is that you are saved by faith. It wasn't a sacrifice that you were going to offer, hoops you were going to jump through. It was a gift from God that needs to be received through faith in Jesus plus nothing. That's the gospel of grace. Paul is referencing all of that. He says, since now you have this righteousness that comes through faith, his words, this is what he calls it, a righteousness, a right standing with God. Now because of your faith in Jesus, when God looks at you, he doesn't see you and the giant clown car of bad decisions and mistakes that you've made. He sees the beautiful, spotless robe of Jesus. You've been justified. Because of your faith in Jesus, Jesus' record is now yours. And Paul says, therefore, because of all of that, because of the good news which you heard, because of this, the nature of the very universe has changed. There's a new currency. It turns out love actually does win. Because of that, because of everything you've seen, therefore, in view of God's mercy. That's an important point. In view of God's mercy. That's why what Paul is saying here is remarkable. In view of God's mercy. Do you realize how profound that is? This would have been shocking. And it still is shocking if you have eyes to see it. Because many people have read these words and heard these words. These are some of the most famous words in all of the book of Romans. Yet they will not perceive the absolute scandal at the heart of it. In view of God's mercy. Every other tradition, the very tradition that Jesus' first context, he's talking to Torah-observant Hebrew Israelites. Their whole system of relating to God was based on a sacrificial system where you have, there's sin and then there are sin offerings. You make a mistake, Generally speaking, the gravity of the mistake, the gravity of the sin was commensurate to the gravity of the size of the sacrifice. If you made a little mistake, you might have to offer some bread or pigeons. If you made a big mistake, you're talking rams and goats and the rest, right? Through that heuristic, through that metric, through that view, through that philosophy, the only reason to be good, the only reason to do the right thing, the only reason to really love people is because you're afraid. It is essentially, in essence, a fear-based paradigm. Some Christians might call this a works-based theology. I'm going to do certain things in order to get God to be pleased with me. The fundamental foundational principle in every single tradition, every philosophy which has ever existed is that I have to toe the moral line. I've got to keep the ethics. I've got to keep the statutes. And if I don't, God's going to get me. He's going to hurl lightning bolts at me. There's going to be some kind of curses that are ensuing. This is inherently fear-based, right? You're just doing stuff so you don't get in trouble. And you can motivate people this way. It's good motivation. It's not great motivation. But here's the problem. Underneath all of it is what? It's self-service. I'm doing these things in order to A, get blessings, or B, avoid some kind of punishment. Ultimately, it ends up being self-serving. If I am kind and generous to somebody, it's not because I legitimately love them, I'm compassionate about them, they've been made in the image of God, they're perhaps my Christian brother or sister. No, I'm trying to assuage God's anger or purchase or earn his love. And it simply won't work. There are a couple of things that whole framework produces in people, but one of them is crippling anxiety. If you believe, go with me here, this is a thought exercise. If you believe that you can work and earn God's love and favor, if you can cobble together a resume of great deeds, generosity, blessings, and take it to God and say, look, God, now you owe me salvation and a blessed life, a couple of things will happen. You may convince yourself that you're doing just that. And then you'll be insufferable. No one's going to want to be around you. Or you're going to be perpetually anxious because maybe you think you did a good job yesterday, but what about today? What about tomorrow? What about next week? You're never going to know where you stand. If that's how you relate to God, by doing a bunch of good stuff in order to get him to love you, you'll never know where you stand. But in view of God's mercy, in view of Jesus, he purchased your pardon on Calvary once and for all. God's love is on your life. What does Paul say in Romans? If you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and he rose from the dead, that you'll be saved. It cannot be taken away because it wasn't something that you purchased yourself. It was given to you by the sovereign hand of God. It cannot be stripped away in view of his mercy. Now, offer your bodies as living sacrifices. This is the facets of the Christian life. This is what it looks like. The nature of it is you're going to now, in view of God's mercy, give yourself. And then Paul uses these words, living sacrifice. This is really weird. Living sacrifice. In Greek, it's even weirder. The word sacrifice is literally the word that means killing. So this, if you were to translate, it says you're going to be a living killing. What is he talking about? Well, he's being intentionally paradoxical because, again, he's referencing sacrifice. That would have been something that was really accessible to both the Greco-Romans and the Hebrew people. That's his audience, right? This would have been something that they would have been familiar with. There are sacrifices within the Greco-Roman pantheon. There is the Levitical laws of the Hebrews' practices and the Torah observant Hebrew people. They would have sacrificed in the temple. So this is something that everybody would have been very familiar with. But then Paul says you're going to be a living sacrifice. Well, that's odd. And that would have raised everybody's eyebrows. And just to paint a little picture for you of what God's relationship with Israel looked like prior to Jesus, prior to the crucifixion and the resurrection, there is an ancient historian by the name of Josephus Flavius. And Josephus, he was in Jerusalem in the first century, the week preceding the Passover. And this is one of the high holidays, so everybody in Israel would make their way up to Jerusalem for this feast, the Passover feast. And each family was supposed to sacrifice a male lamb without blemish in the temple. And then, they eat that part of that lamb as the Passover supper. This particular time, this historian counted 250,000 lambs, being sacrificed the week preceding Passover at the temple in Jerusalem. Picture it. Go there with me for a second. This is the spring in ancient Palestine. There is no refrigeration. There is no air conditioning. There is this ritual sacrifice that the Hebrew people have done for centuries in order to assuage and propitiate the wrath of God because they had sinned before him. And that relationship looked like the blood of 250,000 lambs pouring off of the altar, pouring out of the temple, I assume mixing with the dirt and the dust, and it must have smelled to high heaven. And that is what God's relationship with his people looked like before Jesus. And now Paul is saying, you're going to be a living sacrifice. And he's saying it's paradoxical because he wants us to understand the difference. You're not literally dying, you're figuratively dying. You're not literally going to be, on the altar, and you're figuratively taking your hands off of your life. This is a figurative death. You have to, as it happens, die to yourself in view of God's mercy. And then the other thing you want to notice about it is it's comprehensive. When you offer a sacrifice, you offer the whole thing. You're not going to, you don't take that little lamb up to the temple and just take the leg. It's the whole kit and caboodle, right? When you offer your bodies as living sacrifice, it is comprehensive. And it has been a critique of Christians that I have heard, and maybe you have heard it too, that a lot of us act like Christians the most on a Sunday, and the rest of the week, shaky ground. This is comprehensive. It's your whole life. It's what you're doing with your time, your treasure, your talent, your Monday through Saturday. It's how you relate with people at work. It's how you conduct your business. It's how you pay your taxes. It's comprehensive. It's holistic. And your body, by the way, is the outworking of your soul in the world. If you have sincere spiritual convictions about the way things are, the nature of the universe, the nature of sin and repentance and grace, then there is going to be an outworking, a kinesthetic outworking of those convictions, right? It would be logical, right? The next thing is you're going to notice is it is perpetual. It's perpetual. D.L. Moody, a former pastor who's been dead for a long time, he said famously, and I love this, the problem with a living sacrifice, it keeps crawling off the altar, right? I don't know about you, but I keep crawling off of the altar. I remember the moment I told Jesus that I would go into ministry and I was going to follow him. I was very enthusiastic. I became a Christian in my mid-20s, and I was fired up, and I thought I'm going to be a missionary, and then God just kind of called me into pastoral work, and I've given God my life, and I've given it over, and I said, Jesus, you take the wheel, and then I crawl right off that altar. I'll have these moments where I'm saying, gosh, the gospel is so beautiful. Like, Lord, just use me. I will go anywhere you send me. I will do anything your word commands me. I will appreciate and take anything you send into my life because you're good and you're loving and I understand the story. And then I try to crawl off the altar. It's perpetual. If you're a living sacrifice, it means you have to take up your cross daily. As it happens, you have to continually lay your life down because God is going to send new things and new missions and new skills and new gifts and new circumstances He wants you to intervene in different seasons of your life. This is a consistent, ongoing, perpetual process. That's the Christian life. In view of God's mercy, offer yourselves. It's a living sacrifice, continually, daily. Die to yourself. Die to yourself. That's what He's saying. Jesus gave up His life for you. Will you give up your life for Him? Will you serve Him in any capacity that God directs you to? Will you use any of your abilities? Will you go where He sends you? Will you be obedient to His word, even if it tells you to do something you don't particularly like? And the next thing we've got to understand about this living sacrifice is this is not a sin offering. We were talking all about, and this is how a lot of people misconstrue this. You hear, you hear, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. You hear sacrifice, and everybody immediately goes to like an atoning sacrifice, a sin sacrifice. That is the one thing that cannot be in view in consideration of the rest of Paul's letter and the New Testament. This cannot be something that now you are going to do in order to get God to love you. That's how a lot of people mistake this. They say, okay, all right, in view of God's mercy, the gospel, that's great. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Oh, I got to sacrifice in order to see this promise come to fruition, or in order to see the fullness of God's love in my life, I have to sacrifice. It's not what it's saying. It can't be what it's saying. In ancient Judaism, there were two types of sacrifices. There was a sin offering, which we've talked about. This is like the Passover lamb. If you did something, you would go to the priest, you would make the appropriate sacrifice, your sins would be atoned for. Jesus Christ paid the price once and for all. It is not Jesus Christ plus something else. It is Jesus on the cross plus nothing, right? He fulfilled the ceremony. He fulfilled the law. He fulfilled the requirement. He was the Passover lamb, not for a night, but forever and ever and ever. So it can't be a sin offering. So what is this? There's another type of offering in ancient Judaism, and that is something called a burnt offering, a whole burnt offering. And that's the type of offering you wouldn't make to atone for a sin. You would go to the temple because you had seen God do something so beautiful, so amazing, that you just had a reservoir of gratitude boiling up, and you had to offer something to God out of gratitude. That's what's in view. The price has been paid. In view of God's mercy, offer yourselves as a living sacrifice, an offering, because you've seen something so beautiful in Jesus that you can't help it. It's natural. It's reflexive. And you say, yes, when you properly comprehend what he's done on the cross, it's rational, right? And I'm tipping my hand here. That's the next point. In verse 1, it says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. The word proper is a word that, it's the word logikon. It means reasonable. It's logical. We talked about this last week. There is, so much in this passage where he talks about, in verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In verse 3, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. There is so much Paul has been saying and is saying that is cognitive. You have to think about this stuff. And maybe you've heard it said that in order to be a religious person, you have to check your brain at the door. Well, Paul is saying that if you are going to live the Christian life, the very first thing you need to start doing is think. The very thing you need to start doing is thinking. And, this is at variance to a lot of self-help strategies. A lot of them will tell you, well, just don't think about reality. Picture the reality you'd like to, have, and you envision that, and you just do that. When a lot of these strategies will tell you to stop thinking, because if you really, really think about it, life is terrifying. You've been born, your life is like a vapor. It's like a drop in a vast ocean when in consideration of all the vast quantities of time that came before and will come afterwards. You're sitting on a rock that's spinning around a nuclear explosion at 30,000 miles an hour. You want to be anxious? Start thinking. This is why so many other paradigms will tell you, no, don't think about it. Don't think about it. Just visualize something far prettier than that. Paul is saying, think about it. Because if this is true, despite the brevity and the fragility of human life, despite the overwhelming sense that things are not as they should be, there is all this entropy and death all around us. If this is true, think about it. It's logical. There really is light and high beauty forever beyond the reach of this world. There really is. Jesus, the promises are true. He said he's going to prepare a place for us in his Father's house where there are many rooms. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one can come to the Father except through me. If what he said is true, think about it. And then rationally respond. There's a lot of people who may say, okay, I believe the brass tacks. I got the gospel, yes, Jesus saved by grace. I got the brass tacks. But then they live in a way that is deeply illogical in relation to what is allegedly their strongly, most deepest held conviction. You have to, you want to live logically, right? And so what are we talking about here? And he goes on and he talks in verse 6, and he says we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us, prophesying in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve, teaching, then teach. If it's encourage, give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, then do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. There are places in the New Testament, Paul specifically, also Peter, give these lists of what are sometimes called spiritual gifts. There's a couple of things about this. Everybody has them. You see this over and over. In verse 3, it says, to each of you. In verse 4, just as each of us has had one body, and so on, right? And the metaphor he uses here is one of a human body, which he, again, expands on in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. That's your homework. I want you to go read that. And he says, there are no insignificant parts of the body. There are different types of gifts, and everybody has some of these, some mixing of them to an extent, okay? There is, I don't know if you're aware of this, there is an 80-20 rule in church. I was kind of shocked when I found out too. There is an 80-20 rule, and the rule goes like this. 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Have you heard that? It's true. I have a feeling it was true for Pastor Paul, because that's why he's concluding this. He's saying everybody, because out of humility, out of gratitude for God's mercy, everybody has a part to play. Everybody has a gift. Everybody has something that they can bring to bear, and just by way of mentioning it, there are teaching gifts, there are encouragement gifts, there are administration gifts. And I wasn't kidding. I want you all to go home and read Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, and 1 Peter chapter 4 for a comprehensive list of those gifts. Later on this week, you're going to get an email, and I'll know if you didn't read it. You're going to get an email that's going to give you an opportunity to consider some of the needs within this community. What if this was a church? And we have been for a while, I don't know if you know this, but coming out of COVID, there was about 35, 40 people in this community. And the church has like tripled in size over the last 18 months. And for a lot of that has been people coming to Crossroads to receive gospel ministry, right? You pastors teaching the word of God, pastors counseling, praying, small group community, these kinds of things. We are at a crossroads where we desperately want this to be a place where people don't just come to receive gospel ministry, but where everybody who attends here to do gospel ministry. We want this to be a place where it was the job of the evangelist, that's me, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, that's you. And this reminds me a little bit of the X-Men movies, right? This is a bad metaphor, I know. But I'm Professor Xavier in the metaphor, and you guys are mutants who have to learn how to use your powers. All right? I told you it wasn't great, but we're moving on here. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at the types of gifts that Paul is describing, and I want you to, because what does it say? It says, think on it. Verse 3, he says, Father Berg, every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith that God has given you. And then he gives a long list of giftings. I want you to think about it. I want you to assess yourself. You have particular passions. You have stuff that breaks your heart. Guess what? There was a couple of people in this church a few years ago that their heart was just broken because we're in the middle of a COVID pandemic, and all the poor people who live adjacent to this church couldn't buy food. And out of that, well, I'll call it holy discontent, we ended up starting to supply people with food and sundry items. And I remember it was like 2 years ago, is anyone listening? We did it on a Saturday so nobody would watch. When we blew a hole in the side of the building, we put a window in there and we started giving out food because a couple of people had passion around that. And now, because of that passion, there's a whole bunch of similarly disposed people who who found that, and they were also passionate, and they brought all of their skills and experience and abilities to bear on it, and now that little pantry feeds thousands and thousands of people every month. That's how that works. Now, you've got experience, you've got gifting. There are some gifts, like our worship team. They were born. Rebecca, where are you? Man, that song was just incredible. There is a natural gifting that you may have, that you can bring to bear on the kingdom. where you think you might be equipped or called to serve. Growth group leaders, these are people with a little bit of hospitality and some leadership ability who want to open their homes so that Christians who come here can connect and have spiritually significant relationships and grow in their faith and community. That's a high calling. Is that you? Maybe you have a little bit of hospitality in you. Maybe that's a gift that you have. All right. Study the list. Finally, verse 8. If it is so, encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Key phrase in all of those, do it. Do it. Here's the thing. I think there are a lot of my contemporaries and everybody else who's on TikTok, like younger, who are listless and bored because they don't have something to lay themselves out for. And I get it. Oh my goodness. I'll tell you just real quick by way of autobiography, when I got out of the military, and a lot of military folks will deal with this, I remember vividly kicking in a door with a machine gun. And I thought, I'm never going to be that cool again. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. And then God called me into ministry, and I get to use my skills, my passion, my experience to see his kingdom get built here. I'm very convicted that none of us are here in this room by accident. We are in one of the least church, the least Christian places in the hemisphere. Yet we are in one of the most influential cities that has ever existed in the history of the earth. And here we are, a fairly modest and humble church. Yet, on a really consistent basis, this has been something I've been seeing a lot of lately. We're seeing people come to saving faith in Jesus. We're baptizing people. We're seeing this community grow. It's kind of unnerving, actually. But there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity in view of God's mercy to let your life be a part of this story. This is amazing. And we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Oh my goodness. Do you know why I keep going? I can't wait to see what God's going to do next. The way he's held this church in his hand through all that it's been through over these past years. And then to see just his Spirit doing things and to see people seeing the beauty of his grace and responding. Man. You want to be a part of that because this story never ends. And maybe you're here and it's this part of the sermon and you're like, okay, I was evaluating Christianity and this whole offering your body's a living sacrifice doesn't really sound awesome, so you can keep it. In all fairness, you may think that you're free. You may think that you're not offering yourself as a sacrifice to anything, but I promise you that's not true. Every person has something that sits on the throne of their heart. Every person has something in their life that is ascendant, and I promise you, you are sacrificing for it. And many of those things they won't sacrifice for you in return. Jesus says, look, in view of God's mercy, give your life to Jesus. Give your life to Jesus. What else are you going to do with it? You're spinning around a nuclear explosion at 30,000 miles an hour, and one day a trap door is going to open, and the only thing on the other side are going to be the arms of Jesus. And here's why. This is where you get the power for the Christian life. By the way, it's in verse 3 where it says, verse 3 says, "Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed." In light of the gospel, you're going to become a servant because you don't think too highly of yourself. You don't think that, you know what, Jesus didn't die for me. He died for those people over there, addicts and murderers. No, he didn't die for me. There is a way that pride will absolutely destroy your witness, your service, and it wreaks havoc on the foundations of your soul. C.S. Lewis said it. He said, pride is the sin that begets all other sins. He wrote this. He said, according to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. And this is why Paul is enjoining us to think of yourselves with sober judgment. The word sober here means accurate, right? If you're sober, you're going to do things accurately. Think of yourself with sober judgment. In light of the measure of faith that God has given you, in light of the gospel, you know that Jesus didn't die for those people over there, that it was the brokenness in my own soul that required nothing less than the death of the Son of God to see my sins paid for. I can't think too highly of myself. And I can never look across at somebody who maybe I don't enjoy or I don't like and think, I'm not going to serve them. Jesus didn't die for me. He died for those other people. So I don't need to serve the least of these. I don't need to pray for my enemies and pray for those who persecute me. It says, look at yourself with sober judgment. Everybody from Adolf Hitler to Mother Teresa needed the grace of Jesus on their life to be acceptable to God. There is not a single person who could stand on her own merit, take a resume, and say, look, God, now you owe me. It's off the table. In view of his mercy, with sober judgment. Judge yourself soberly. So you are, you cannot have pride in the least. It will destroy your witness. It will destroy your service. The other thing is you can't think too lowly of yourself. You were such a hot mess that Jesus had to die for you, but he loved you so much, he would do it again in a heartbeat. There is, and this says each person has something to bring. He's gifted you. Do you know what our superpower is? Retirees, as it happens. We have a bunch of people in this church that had all kinds of positions and did high-level things in their career, and now they've come to a season of life where they have a lot more time. And so those folks have come here and they've given, and you wouldn't think that's not usually how churches go lately, but that is our superpower at these churches. So everybody has something to give. A lot of what Paul is talking about here is encouragement. And there are different seasons in life. And I was speaking with, a dear sister this morning who is at a season of life where she can't serve in the capacities perhaps she's used to. I have been so encouraged by some of you. There are some people in this church that just encouraged the socks off of me, and I would not have been able to weather some of these storms without that encouragement. That's a gift, and you can do it. If your face still works a little bit, you can do that. Each one of us. Now, Christians, and Paul uses the analogy of a body, right? He said there are parts to a body, but here's what he's saying. He's saying Christians are unique as snowflakes, right? That means that there is things about your story, things about your journey, things about the way God's grace works out in your life that are so specific to you, it means that there are situations that really only you can wade into. That the way that God has worked with each of us, the way that his grace is poured out in our life is so unique and specific that there are hands that only you can hold. And that 80-20 rule, I get fired up. I think about what would it look like if every person that came to Crossroads saw this church as a way for them to engage in this gospel ministry, this like being a living sacrifice and serving and loving and supporting and teaching and exhorting one another until this was until it was so palpable and different. Oh my goodness, what would that mean to the watching world? Would they look in and see something remarkable? I think so. Be a living sacrifice because Jesus was a dying sacrifice. On the other side of the cross, he got disintegration and hell. He gave up the only thing in the universe that really mattered to him, the love of the Father. When he took on the sins of the world, this is why he cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And in John's gospel, the very last thing Jesus screams in the dark is, it is finished. And he did that because he loves you. He became a dying sacrifice, and on the other side of that was hell. You become a living sacrifice, and the thing on the other side of that is the arms of Jesus. Live in light of it. This is God's